So, yeah, tonight we're going to be talking about Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. This is a book that talks about poker, but isn't a poker book. We'll get into that. I'm very excited. This was a LambNRice suggestion. Very happy to have you on the show. Welcome, LambNRice.
For having me.
And of course, I'm here as always with Adraseth. Very happy to be here with you as well.
I just think that anybody who doesn't know who LambRice is and plays StarCraft, and this is a very StarCraft focused podcast, but Lamb, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do? Because I think it's pretty interesting, you as a personality in StarCraft. So what's your story?
Really, you're setting the stage for me. The bar is high. Um, I've been playing StarCraft 2 since it released on the beta. So I think what was it, 2000? Let's say 2010. I think April the beta released, and I'd been playing the game quite a bit. Um, I played a lot during Wings of Liberty. Took a minor pause during Heart of the Swarm, and jumped back in Legacy of the Void. And funny, my friend Ryan, who we kind of grew up in StarCraft together. He had started streaming a couple of months before I did to just document his games. And so for the past a little over a year and a half, I've been streaming part time and have been kind of documenting the ladder grind. Long story short, I am roughly 5K North America Zerg. I've got maybe like 13,000 games under my belt, um, and like to play an aggressive style. Um, and so I will stop the introduction there.
Now, this episode of the Archives Book Club is focusing on a book that has um, well, that is about poker. It's written by a poker player, Annie Duke, Thinking in Bets. So you suggested the book, and I'm actually really glad that you suggested the book because we're going to get into the meat of the book in a little bit here. But do you play poker? It's how did you hear about this book?
I do, yes, and I follow a couple of poker personalities on Twitter. I can't remember exactly how it crossed my desk, but I remember thinking like, "Hey, this book is all about quality decisions with incomplete information." And you always hear like StarCraft paralleled to other games that have complete information. Let's take like chess or Go, for example. And StarCraft is very different from those games for a lot of other reasons, but I think the biggest one being that like, hey, how do you play a strategy game when there is the element of fog of war, right? So like not able to know what your opponent's doing at all times,
Mm-hmm.
and poker is very much the same way. Um, so I thought it might make for a good read, considering I am. I wouldn't call myself an avid poker player. I would call myself a casual, but I would think that I'm an avid StarCraft player. So I picked up the book, started reading it, kind of took a break, didn't finish it, but when we started talking about getting on the book club, or the book archives, I'm sorry, I thought it might be a good reason to finish the book.
I think that it is kind of interesting because anybody who's followed the StarCraft scene, the StarCraft 2 scene, and even the StarCraft 1 scene, there's actually quite a few pro
Yes.
players that have gone on to play poker and quite a few personalities that play poker regularly. And the ones I think of are Todd, and I think Roddy plays some poker as well. But Todd is
Yeah.
often posting on Twitter about his poker escapades, you know?
There's another gentleman, Elke, who is
Yep.
probably the most famous poker player that has StarCraft
Mm-hmm.
roots. Who I think he's probably like the furthest along in the poker scene out of all those guys that we just.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think if I remember right, and I don't know if you guys have seen it, he also is a streamer, so he
Oh, really?
streams poker on Twitch.
I'm
Oh, that's
guessing
cool.
that my mic is picking up the cat just yodeling in the background. Let me see what I
Yes.
can do about that before we get too deep in this. Hey, cat. I can see that you're having a problem. Did you want to make an
We
appearance
have
on the
a
archives tonight? Here,
mascot for
we
the
could do that.
show.
We could do
Chad
that
is a
real
big
quick. All right,
LK
this is
fan.
Spooky. This is the little guy who's just trying to trash the podcast right now. Are you trying to be under a blanket? Is that your deal? Are you cold? Did you want to be under here?
Well, it's really interesting because I have
I
never
think that's all
been
he
a poker
wants.
player,
Okay.
and
All right.
I
Sorry for
find
the
it an
detour,
interesting
everybody.
game.
Animals, no respect. It's just kind of how it works.
just do their thing. You may hear dog barking in the background on my end too, so I am not in.
It's a pet stream. All right, so we were talking about personalities crossing over from SC2 to poker. Aren't there also a few poker personalities who have some amount of regard for StarCraft as well? It seems like it crosses both directions. I'm struggling to think of why I think that, or who the example was, but I feel like that's the case.
No,
Oh,
nobody comes to mind
hmm.
initially, but if you think about both games, I think there are, while not at the surface level, but if you think about it, I think there are a couple of transferable skills that
Mm-hmm.
go in both directions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in both games, you are trying to make decisions with limited time without all the information. And I
Yep.
think this is where this book is pretty relevant.
Definitely.
I know that there's other gamers that will often reference StarCraft as like a very difficult skill-based game. And if you watch other streams on Twitch or you kind of are around the gaming scene, you'll hear it from time to time where people will talk about StarCraft and be like, "Wow, that's a really hard game."
Yeah.
And so I think it's universally accepted that StarCraft is difficult. And there are games like you made the analogy between chess and StarCraft, or I thought you did, but
Yeah.
even if you didn't, I'm going to make it. There was a lot of people that would say like, oh, chess or Go or something is a lot like StarCraft, but this part of the game that's incomplete information is really interesting. And so I'm actually, I say this every archives apparently. I really like this book. I thought it was a very interesting book. Um, so I will start off by saying that this book, what I like to call the title is, and Eric said it already, but thinking in bets, making smarter decisions when you don't have all the facts. I like to call it 200 plus pages of learning not to blame the game for your bad decisions, because there's a big portion of this book that talks about making good decisions and understanding that your decision making is really what is responsible for you doing well or not doing well. And I really believe in StarCraft, this is an ongoing problem, a decades long problem now of people blaming the game or balance or a race or a strategy, whatever, for their losses, when in reality, we need to be looking inwards. And this book is all about that. And I really, really like that topic because it's one of those books that if you read it and you do take it to heart, it's you can gain so much from this
Yep.
book.
And not just from or not just within the, I always harp on this every episode, not just within the scope of StarCraft, right? Like StarCraft is a very, very good playground for exercising these skills and practicing the things that we're going to talk about. But you'll find these skills are applicable across everything in your life, right? Any amount of variance in anything that you do automatically means you're going to be able to leverage these skills. We kind of already hit this point, but something that Annie Duke is very careful to point out early on is this is not a poker book. She goes so far as to say, quote, "This book is not about poker or gambling. It is, however, about the things poker taught me about learning and decision making. Thinking in bets starts with recognizing that there are exactly two things that determine how our lives turn out: the quality of our decisions and luck."
And we should point out that if you're not familiar with this book or you hadn't read it, and I
Mm-hmm.
think based on our
Ah, yes.
viewership, we did take the poll about who's reading the book with us and who's not. Totally fine if you don't read the books because we just like to discuss strategy and StarCraft and thinking and brains and learning and all that. Annie Duke is somebody who is an ABD. If you're not familiar with an ABD is, it's all but dissertation. So this is a person that went through a PhD and didn't defend the dissertation, so they don't have the PhD, but basically did all the work. And that happens a lot in academia. People get burned out, and there's many, many reasons, particularly for women, especially when they're working in scientific type of fields. They can get pushed out of their programs quite easily. So um, in this book, I took her to be quite the authority on this sort of cognitive thinking and decision making and understanding how that works. So if you're not familiar with her, you should be because she's quite an interesting person, has a lot of good things to say. So the fact that it's not actually a poker book, even though she is a poker champion in many ways,
Mm-hmm.
doesn't really matter, because the skills that we talk about in this book not only apply to our favorite game, StarCraft, but also to life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think I think a large theme in the book is kind of centered around what we place blame or fault on for certain outcomes that occur. And poker is obviously a good analogy, but like for anything, right? And I think it really challenges the reader to really think about like, okay, well, if I take this framework and apply it to, some memory or some historical thing that had happened,
Mm-hmm.
that maybe I previously believed to be out of my control or someone else's fault or bad luck. Um, was there an opportunity for me to alter the outcome that I wasn't thinking about? Or what are the other factors involved that I overlooked? Right. And I think that framework is really hard to kind of get towards. And I think when you play a game like poker, when you play a game like StarCraft, like the losses burn pretty bad, probably more so in poker because you're losing a lot of money. Um, but I think like that feedback loop is quite good, right? And it's a good thing to experience, right? And you will never be, and this is probably for everybody in the world outside of a couple of handful of players, is like you'll never be the best player in the world. And so if you think like, hey, I'm a 4K Zerg player and I keep losing to Protoss, and here you are saying Protoss is overpowered, and here are like the 10 reasons why, you have to think to yourself like, but then why am I at 4K,
Yep.
right? There is a reason that I am not 5K. There's a reason I'm not 6K or GM or on the pro circuit. Why haven't I discovered those reasons, or why haven't I called those out? And I think that's a really important theme that kind of keeps coming up throughout the course of the book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, totally right. Because there does exist some person who plays your race who's that MMR, right? What things are they doing that you aren't doing? And
Mm-hmm.
when you put it like that, it's like, well, yeah, right. Like you can't really, I can't argue with you, you know.
Right.
Um, but it's very easy when we're within our own head or in a social context where it's okay to be whiny, right? To kind of fall into some of these traps. One thing that just popped into my head. This is totally off topic from what you just said, but uh, I forgot to address that there are some tweaks in format that we made. So Seth made the point earlier that if you haven't read the book, we're going to be catering to that. So in this episode, you can expect us reading a lot more quotes as well. And we also have literal God Lord Cranial in the chat to help us with Q&A. So at any point during tonight, if you have a question or there's an interesting point that we bring up that you want to talk deeper about or pull on a thread more, feel free to just add Lord Cranial in the chat. He will be kind of feeding us those questions because last episode, everybody had really amazing questions and they got lost in the spam because we got a big raid. So we don't want that again. Yeah, so Lord Cranial is Lord of Questions for the evening. And sorry for this PSA interrupting our discussion here, guys.
So one thing
Big
I
fan of
wanted
Lord
to
Cranial, by the way. Before you
he
go
is a
on.
hero of StarCraft, literally saving esports peak right now. One thing I wanted to add on to what LambNRice was talking about just a second ago is that, and it says in the book, and it's maybe partly what I was thinking while I was reading the book, but also what was in the book, is this sort of we're pre-programmed a little bit to have this "I should have known better" attitude,
Mm-hmm.
and this is where we beat ourselves up a lot in StarCraft. At least I do. I think Eric can speak to this as well.
Yep.
When we lose a game and like, oh shit, I should have known X was going to happen. I should have known because I scouted this, and I should have known, and I should have done better. And when LambNRice was saying that the losses burn pretty hard, it's actually a established effect in psychology that people treat things that are negative, like losses, as literally twice as bad as a win. So
Mm-hmm.
when we lose, we're way, way feeling worse than we do when we win in terms of feeling better, if we compare those two feelings. And this is a downward spiral that you can get yourself into in StarCraft that doesn't help you effectively get better or learn,
Yep.
because from that you can you don't like to feel bad because you're losing, so then to shift that negative feeling away, you start blaming something else. And this is a natural response that humans have because we don't like to be wrong. And it goes a little bit into something that Annie Duke brought up in the book, and that's the type 1 error and the type 2 error. And not to get too nitty gritty, but basically, it's very important like the evolutionary history of humans. It's very important for humans to be more likely to misidentify something and be wrong. So the example in the book is like a lion out in the Serengeti. If you think you saw a lion, but there really wasn't one, well, that's better than not seeing a lion and there was one and you get eaten. And so we're pre-programmed to feel bad about losing, about being wrong, because it quite literally could have saved our ancestors in the wild when, there was predators out that could eat humans. And so this is a completely natural thing that we experience. And now in our civilized world, when we're sitting behind our computer screen playing StarCraft and we put a lot of effort into something and we feel a lot of identity with that thing, when we lose, we're like, I am bad because I lost. Natural feeling comes on. And then we associate that with our actions. So you either do one of two things: you internalize it and you beat yourself up, or you externalize it and you blame the game. And those are the normal things that happen. Unfortunately, they don't help you learn at all.
Right. Yeah. This was super cool actually to read the thing about the science of it literally feeling twice as bad to lose as to win. Um, so when I started doing like the focus goal thing, when I like stole that from Maynard, I'm like, what's a good success rate, right? And I just totally like half-assed a number. I'm just like, I don't know. If I go like 70-30, that'll probably feel like pretty good and cool, right? Like I'll probably like that. And it turns out that's like actually pretty close to what the science says. And I didn't have anything to base that on. I didn't know, necessarily like, that I was doing like pretty close to the exactly optimal thing, right? I guess if you figure the losses feel twice as bad, right? I'm getting 70% win rate and 60% loss rate, so it feels like a little bit good, right? If I'm able to achieve that, so highly recommend that if you're going to do focus goals, like try to calibrate it to where you're hitting that 70% rate or so.
Era, I know you're big on focus goals.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain that for
Yeah,
the folks who might not?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the focus goal concept is I'm going to pick something other than win this ladder game as my sort of alternative thing to feel good about. Another phrasing that I've heard, Neuro calls this a criteria for moral victory, right? So it's like just something that can give me a feel good, some other side quest, some little mission that I can have in the ladder game. It could be I've got some, awkward hotkey mistake that I keep making that I want to just iron out of my play. It could be a macro thing, like don't supply block, keep my money under such and such, hit a certain timing with a certain composition. It could be mini map awareness. I mean, you name it. But the idea is it is something that is tangential to you winning the game. It might help you win the game, but it isn't, focus goal, win 10 ladder games, right? That's not a
Mm.
good goal.
Yeah, that makes sense. It kind of gives you like some rewards that will lead to the reward of winning it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. The idea is you're making a longer term investment and you're giving yourself additional ways to feel good, right? I'll often say on ladder, while I'm doing the ladder stream, oh, cool. I beat the focus goal, right? Lost the game, but I beat the focus goal. Or alternatively, oh man, I did terrible on this goal, but hey, we won at least. So it's like I kind of take whichever half of it is feeling good in the moment.
That's a really interesting thing too, because anybody who's watched your stream for some time, and I still will argue that I'm maybe the longest follower of Eret that's around. We'll see if anybody can dethrone me from that. But um, you essentially you've reprogrammed your brain to make a positive association with losing, in that you still are learning and you're still winning something, right? You're still accomplishing something. And so therefore you can feel good even though you lost the game.
Mm-hmm.
And typically when people play StarCraft, because StarCraft's relatively a young game when we think about like the history of humans, right? Chess has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, whereas StarCraft is like maybe 20 years old ish, right? And even in the beginning when nobody really played it online, that was still like the internet was still a thing. And
As
so
my green also.
It's okay. We're going to the
flying
top of
away.
live stream fails now, man. I love it.
Yeah, no, we got them all. We're knocking out all the um but because it's relatively new game, nobody knows how to play it, right? Like the way that
Mm-hmm.
people got good in the early days was just a grind,
Yep.
just grinding the game again and again and again to get good. And when you do that, you're not, you will eventually get good because repetition will make you better at things. It's not the most effective way to go. And also, if you don't have a really strong mental fortitude, you will get really frustrated.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is the crux like, okay, now after 6 books that we've read on this show, I think we've actually found the thing that is keeping people in whatever league they're stuck in, if they're forever diamonds or forever platinum or whatever. This is the thing. This is the thing that's holding you back.
Mm-hmm.
It's your mentality and not letting yourself grow because you are not taking responsibility for those decisions and you feel bad when you do take responsibility. You haven't made that positive association. So
Mm,
Eret is like quite literally the poster child for fixing that mentality. And he just hit Diamond 1 for the first time
Yep.
this week, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Incredible. Incredible. Right? So this is like a huge deal, I think, to the community at large. If you are listening to this and you are stuck in a league, it is your mentality that is keeping you there.
yeah, that's kind of
And oh, go for it,
no,
LambNRice. Go for it.
I was just going to add to that point. I'm just saying that if you're stuck in a league, to piggyback off Adverseth's point, it's on you. Uh, it's kind of harping on like the age-old adage of if you're not GM, your opinion on balance doesn't matter. There is some truth to that, right? Like you have grounds for improvement that you're not calling out. Your focus should be there, um, and I think there's some truth there.
Mm-hmm. The bit that I wanted to tack on, so we're both just adding on to Adresseth here. The bit I wanted to tack on is, crucially, this is not your fault, right? Everything that he just said is true. It's also not your fault. So don't do the thing where you're now having meta emotions and feeling bad that you feel bad about your ladder, right? Like, um, you know,
Inception bad.
yeah. Like you're wired to do this, and it's an interesting point. You know, Adresseth said that I've kind of like rewired my brain or whatever to be able to do this, and I guess it's kind of true, right? Because I've had people see the focus goal thing, try to do it, and report back and be like, yeah, it didn't work for me, and I think it's because like you have to really emotionally buy in, right? If you're just like doing some sort of scorekeeping, right, and you're writing points down on a card that don't mean anything to you, it's kind of whatever. And I think I intuitively figured that out to begin with because I'm a very emotionally driven person. I've known that about myself for a long time. Um, so in order to be able to do something like this, I knew right away, like I have to like really believe that these pretend victory points I'm giving myself have meaning in some way, right? And I mean, I do this with everything in my life. Like my sister once had a boyfriend who I didn't like, and I'm like, shit, I better find something about this dude to like because it's gonna everybody's gonna know. So I found something about that guy that was like redemptive in some way, and I just latched onto it for dear life. Like you have to method act it. You have to really believe that your focus goal means something. Um, yeah, okay, that's my soapbox. Sorry.
That's a great point, and I think that to reiterate it, the when you so the concept is simple, right? That we are pre-wired to have this mentality, and this mentality drives people either to blame themselves or blame the game, and then that is impeding their progress,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we'll get to there's an example in the book that I recall that is kind of pointed. So the concept is simple. The execution is very difficult, right? To stop this behavior means you have to stop a very strong habit that's really wired into you. And so when I say Eret has literally rewired his brain, this is absolutely true. He has reset himself to view StarCraft in a different way than ordinarily would take place if you just got on the game and played. And that's so important if you want to improve, right? At anything in life, if you want to improve, you have to be able to like stay, detached from those emotions. And one way to do it is to focus goals, and that works well for him. There are other ways to do it, but you have to do that, right? And I think probably the most obvious example in the community, the most popular example in the community, if anybody's watched Neuro's stream, Neuro is detached his emotions from the game so that he can get the most out of every game and learn the most out of every game and be good at something he finds fun. And that's where you need to get, really.
I wanna challenge that thought and ask the question if detaching your emotions is a preferred route versus channeling negative emotions, and maybe it means the same thing. What do you guys think?
I think it's a fascinating question, actually, and I was going to jump on Adraseth over this too, actually, but in a different way. I think your way is
You know, I love you.
I think your way is way more interesting. Gosh, so I guess the question is, can you channel that negative emotion into something that does what you want it to, right? It is clearly a source of energy, right? We have seen that source of energy break keyboards and God knows what else, right? Um,
Famously.
yeah, yeah. I mean, there's clips that people who don't even play StarCraft have watched, right? Um, so what thoughts do you have on how you would do that type of channeling?
It's a good question. I don't want to get too off topic from the book, but there's a study. It's called the Dreyfus. I've mentioned a couple times on stream. It's like the Dreyfus something or other of skill acquisition, and there are 5 stages. I won't go through them. One of the pieces references uh, feeling bad about not accomplishing or doing the thing correctly is actually a preferred state of mind as opposed to being completely emotionally removed from it. And so the idea here is that like if you want to get good at something, you have to hurt when you fail at the thing, right? And only through that failure can you master the thing that you're doing, which I thought was interesting. I don't know if I fully agree with it. I think it's a compelling, contradicting thought. Um, but I think you see examples of it out there, right? Like all of the stories of like professional athletes who make it to some certain level, they all say like, I had to fail 1,000 times before I succeeded, and it hurt, and I cried myself to sleep, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there's some truth to that. And it's like you have to think these guys like channeled some negative emotion, right? Like people who have dropped the game-winning touchdown come back the next year to catch like 100 touchdowns. And they're like, I only because I failed it like fueled me to go back to work twice as hard, right? And it kind of like ignites a fire under them. Um, and I think there's some merit to that. I don't know if that's a sustainable approach, but I think you can see people finding like paths to success doing that.
I almost wonder if it's personality driven too. Like I think for me, I don't know that I would have as much fire for the game if I blunted all the emotional response. There is a piece of the book we're talking about tonight that does address this, and it I believe agrees with Adraseth and not me. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I This is a tough one for me. I think. What I was going to challenge about this actually is not that necessarily you get a lot the piece of it where you get something out of the negative emotion, but rather the assertion that Neuro has done this disconnect of his emotions from what's happening in the latter game. Because I've heard him say, there's times he gets off the stream and he's like ready to scream or whatever. It's that he has put a firewall in between those internals and whatever his output is, the things that he chooses to act upon, which is almost more of like a stoicism thing, right? This is like, aside from like skill level and view count and entertainment value, the biggest difference between his stream and mine is that I can't do that thing. I will never be able to do that, right? If you watch my stream,
Guilty.
You too?
Still guilty.
Yeah. Yeah, like you're never getting that firewall. You're gonna know I'm hard on my sleeve. I tried to stream the other night, didn't have a focus goal. I was just trying to take a baseline. Where is my cannon play at? I was flipping out, man. I was hating life. It was bad. It was not good.
I
Um,
think this is. Oh,
no, no, no,
sorry,
go for
you
it, go
may not
for
be
it.
finished. I think this is the. It's just there's more than one way to accomplish this goal of allowing resetting your brain in a way to learn from your mistakes. And stoicism as a philosophy is one way. And I don't know, I mean, Neuro's not here to speak for himself, so we probably shouldn't, you know, say too much more, but I would
Let's just
guess,
put so many words in his mouth.
yeah, let's just put all the words.
He's not
um
watching, so
I would guess he should, but I would guess that he's probably a stoic of sorts, or appreciates stoicism in his mannerisms. That's my guess. Um, and I feel like I fall more in that category than I fall in the category like Eret. Uh, and it's just an interesting thing. I think both can accomplish the same thing. Is that for me, detaching my emotions from the game is better for me because I would prefer to be neutral towards the game than to feel one way or the other. But maybe for other people that doesn't work. The fact still remains that you have to look inwards toward your decision making. Whether you are doing something like the focus goals to give yourself a mental reward for doing something correctly, and then that frees your mind up to look at mistakes and look at the game objectively. That works. Or if you're like me, and lately I've been doing the meme builds, and in a way, it's funny because my experience with the meming is it actually in my head I do this thing of like, well, I didn't win because I'm only building 2 units. And because that's going on in my head, I can just take a step back and be like, okay, what mistakes did I make when I was macroing? What mistakes did I make when I was scouting? What mistakes did I make with my army position? Because those actually are pretty important, at least in my stage of gameplay, for me to learn from. And so I can then, and I've been doing this at the end of my games, type GG well played. Whereas in the past, I could barely get the GG out in some games, and I would do it. I never rage at people online. That's my one rule. That's the limitation I have. But sometimes I would just be so upset, and I would never be like, "Well, they did not play well. Are you kidding me?" So for me, detaching the emotions has been actually beneficial. But I think there's just more than one method here.
yeah, I think I buy that.
I'm into it.
So moving along, Aaron is continually highlighting some quotes because I think we got a little bit derailed, but the discussion is still highly interesting. So
Yeah.
one of the quotes that I guess I put down is thinking in bets triggers a more open-minded explanation of alternative hypothesis of reasoning and supporting conclusions opposite to the routine of self-serving bias. In other words, if you do this method, you will have more of an open mind towards what is going on in front of you. So the reality of what's going on. And we've already talked about it, but poker is a game of incomplete information. It is the game of decision making under conditions of uncertainty over time. Not coincidentally, this is close to the definition of game theory. And so when you have and this actually to me, when I think of chess or Go, or it could be anything that has like very strict rules, like boxing, um, that's not representative of the real world. And StarCraft, I think, is more representative of the world because we are constantly going through life, making decisions based on limited information, right? We don't know what's going to happen in the future. We're trying to predict it. And so far as like, we can barely predict the weather in the next day or two, right? Because the world has a lot of randomness and chaos in it, and we don't quite understand it. And as a human being walking through the world, or, going through about our day, it's difficult to get to the point where you want to put everything in a box and label it nicely, and it all fits there, and you can predict what's going to happen, and your 5-year plan and your 10-year plan. But life isn't like that. We don't have all the information. We don't know what's going to happen the next day. And you could go out, and get hit by a car. Like you don't know what's going to happen. And so when we try to make decisions and we put it in this black and white world, it gets really messy. And then we get in this mentality of blaming ourselves or blaming the world or whatever it is. And StarCraft is like this beautiful representation of life.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a little out on a limb, but
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think StarCraft has way more unknowns, and so it's way more representative of like good decision making in any scenario. Like good decision making is just a good quality for people to have.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you think about like okay, let's take for example, um, I live in New York, right? And let's take for example, I was trying to find a new career path, and so the job opportunity opens up in Florida, it opens up in Colorado, it opens up in Michigan and California. I've been to 3 out of 4 of those places. The job opportunity in the place that I haven't had is going to pay the most, and the person who I would be being managed by seems best in this other place. And so now I'm getting all of these different like inputs of like things that I might be gravitating towards for different reasons. And at the end of the day, there is you can't catalog all of the different pieces that go into making a decision of that magnitude, especially if you haven't done it before, right? So you don't have experience doing it. Um, and how can you make the best quality decision there? You can't play out 4 outcomes and then measure them all against each other, right? You can only make the best decision that you have based on the information that you're getting up front and then follow that, right? And I think one part of the book that Annie Duke references is having what she calls like I think she called it like an accountability group,
Mm-hmm.
right? So like people who uh, I'm assuming she implies that it's like a common shared interest, right? So she has her poker buddies. She reviews hands with them. She talks about like some of her decisions she made, and she authentically asks them if what she was doing is the correct or incorrect, or what level of quality decision did she make, right? And so she's looking for feedback, and I think that's super important in terms of trying to make these decisions when you don't have information like that, because maybe somebody out there does.
Mm-hmm.
I have a lot more thoughts on this, but I don't want to totally like derail
No,
us or like keep
no,
going in that direction.
that's fine. That's totally great. Yeah, the decision making or truth seeking group thing definitely is one of the, I think, big lessons. One of the things that I wanted to kind of have us all establish before we like really start diving into more of the quotes and concepts from the book. LambNRice is saying there's all this decision processing, right? Um, and so we've kind of all said now that StarCraft is, I mean, maybe you don't want to go out so far on a limb and say it's a metaphor for life, but certainly it's a very good sandbox for practicing skills that are useful in life, right? I don't think that's going out on a limb at all. Um, and so, okay, if we're going to talk about decision making, let's think of what categories exist within StarCraft that, what kinds of decisions do we make, right? So, um, I think there are really three. There are things that I'm going to do before I'm in a game, right? So, how am I going to practice for whether it's tournament game, ladder game, you name it, right? How am I going to practice? How am I going to prepare? Then there's a category of, all right, now I'm in that game. Well, I've got all kinds of decisions to make. How many resources should I commit to getting information, right? Opening up the fog of war and giving myself better ammunition to make decisions later at the cost of resources now. And attention even being one of those resources, right? How much time should I spend thinking about all these things and doing the evaluation loop and prioritizing all of my stuff, right? There's all of these decisions and meta decisions of what in-game and out-of-game resources am I expending as I'm doing my decision loops within StarCraft. So very, very rich space of lots of layered decisions there. And then when you're out of the game and you barely typed out GG, well played, right? And you're mad, how do you interpret and process the information that you just got? Because that game was information, right? It was information about you, it was information about your opponent, and you can do a number of things there. And the book will talk about this. So a little foreshadowing here. Anything that you do is information processing, including being pissed, hitting F10N, and queuing the next game, right? By doing that, you're saying, the hell with that game. There's nothing for me to learn there, right? That is processing of the information. You're just processing it into the trash can, right? So, like, there's no escaping this. You're going to be doing the processing. It's just a question of how you're doing it.
That's a really interesting point, and we'll talk more about it. But tilting is a thing. We know it in StarCraft. It happens in poker as well, and it is related to the F10N queue up again, right?
Yep.
And a lot of people do that. And whether you know it or not, probably a lot of habit there going on. You've sort of have this habit of, well, I'm just going to do the next one because that game was crap and I don't want to think about it. But if you're doing that and you're on tilt, you're sort of reinforcing that tilt, right? Because you're doing it again and doing it again. And I've definitely done this in StarCraft. I don't know if you guys have, but I have played many hours where I just lose game after game after game, and I just keep queuing. And it's like, it's almost like you're a robot, or at least I felt like it is almost like you're a robot.
Yeah,
I think it's universally better to, when losing a game, to take a minute, watch the replay, reflect on why you lost. Like if you're optimizing towards getting better at the game, right? Everyone plays the game for different reasons, but if you're optimizing towards getting better at the game and winning more, do you think it is universally better to just take a second, watch the replay, identify the top whatever 3 things that you want to highlight about like why you lost, or do you think is there merit also in queuing up again? Like, do you think there's a reasonable reason why people do that?
Good question. For me, I think there's always merit in doing it, but I have no basis and no way to know whether that is a quirk of my personality or if that is a thing that is generally true.
I always queue back up again, and I'm guilty of it. And when it's bad, dude, it spirals bad.
Yeah.
And I will not watch the replays. I'm just partly because it's also on stream, and I feel like there's a sense of shame when you lose on stream in front of the massive viewer count of like 6 people that are there.
All very opinionated though.
Yeah, but it's like you're trying to chase that good feeling and erase that bad feeling, right? Going back to what we were talking about before. And it's like the only way of reestablishing the good feeling and running away from the bad feeling is winning. Like I have to win in order to do that. And I think StarCraft tends to interest people who have some level of like competitive energy. And I feel like people are chasing that feeling. It's almost like you're like a freaking meth junkie and you want to get that dopamine hit. You're like, I need it. Like, let me go after it again. And I have to play a 20-minute macro game. Otherwise it's not going to be really good.
Yeah.
And in a way you're kind of like, you're like a dog with a treat. You're like super tunnel visioned just towards getting that.
I would say Eric's point was really quite good here, and I can my own. Once again, if StarCraft's such an interesting game, and I think there probably is data that could be assembled about this because there's so many interesting aspects about player behavior, but optimally, I would say probably the best way would be to stop, take a look at the replay, identify what you did wrong, and then correct it, right? I think if we go back to some of the books that we have studied in this podcast series, like Make It Stick, for example, or Dinner Game of Tennis, those would sort of be pointing towards that direction of actions. However, again, it's a simple concept, but it's extremely difficult to do, right? Because you may be fighting a habit that is so deeply grooved in your brain that you wouldn't get anything out of watching the replay. You would just go like, yeah, you see that stupid bullshit I just lost to? And it wouldn't actually improve you, right? Because if you don't have that objectivity when you're looking at your mistakes. And this is in the book a little bit later, but there's a time where Annie is still kind of a beginner, but starting to do well at poker. And she loses some match, and she goes up to somebody much better than her, who's quite famous, and says, going up to complain about the game that she lost, the hand that she lost. And the guy says something like, well, if you're not going to try and get better, like, I don't want to hear it. Like, if you're not interested in trying to identify what you did wrong, I don't want to talk to you. And that is, you almost need like the little angel and devil on your shoulders doing that while you're watching a replay, right? You need somebody in your ear being like, listen, if you're not going to actually accept your actions, then there's no point in watching this. And so I think that optimally, yes, that wouldn't be the correct way to go. But again, the concept simple, execution extremely difficult, at least for me. Extremely difficult.
Yeah. I think you're referencing Eric Seidel, who is like a 8-time champion of something or other, who's like a fantastic poker player who I think Annie looked up to as a mentor. And when reading that, it made me think of like some of the subreddits. So I'm like subscribed to like All Things Zerg, right? And I don't know if you guys subscribe to like All Things Protoss, All Things Terran, All Things Zerg, whatever.
Yeah.
How many of you guys have seen this where it's like, oh, I lost this replay, bullshit, insert race here. And then they throw it out there and they say like, somebody help me. And I look at that example and all I can think of is the Eric Seidel moment of like, hey, you need to start helping yourself a little bit more in order for me to be able to help you too. Because like the mindset you're in is unhelpable.
Yeah.
Like you haven't taken steps to help yourself. Like there's nothing I can do for you. I can't offer you anything. Even if I told you what you did wrong, I already know you're going to reject it.
Yeah. So kind of like we'll have to moving along here because we got so many good things. One thing that I wrote down in our notes is about deliberate practice, and this kind of came up when I was thinking about the book, and reading the book in context of other stuff that we have read and talked about on the book. And so it's sort of this, like we've talked about with Eric's focus goals. To get to that point where you can help yourself takes practice, and it takes focus practice. So really, like, StarCraft's so interesting, right? Because you get good at StarCraft and all of the fundamental skills that are encompassed in StarCraft, such as like APM, dexterity, hand-eye coordination, in addition to knowing the units and that sort of thing. You actually need to take time to train yourself so that you can identify your errors and get rid of this sort of mentality of blaming the game or blaming bad luck or blaming whatever, and accept what your actions were in the context of the information you had, then identifying whether or not that was a problem. And it takes this deliberate practice. And so this is something that I don't know, I've not heard anybody say, either on coaching streams or on YouTube or on Reddit or wherever. I have not heard anybody say this, that there should be time dedicated to improving and practicing a certain mentality so that you can identify objectively your mistakes. That is something that's really tricky. And I've, like you were saying, LambNRice, I've seen it on Reddit. In fact, I stopped reading Reddit because I found it not helpful for me at all. There's just too much of this is BS and people arguing back and forth, and I just found it not a place to gain knowledge. And so I just stopped doing that, and I decided, well, I can just learn on my own, right? Like I can just practice on my own and try and be objective about my own play. So
what I think is really beautiful about the skill sets you were just outlining is it is all of those physical components, and then what's interesting is apart from that you have the intellectual exercise of breaking down a replay or figuring out what the problems are, but you also have an emotional intelligence piece of it, right? Where you have to like be a master of yourself and your own heart in a way while you're doing that intellectual exercise. And I think that that's really neat because it really touches on so many aspects of like the human experience.
Whoa.
Not to go too deep.
That's super deep, man. I'm trying to figure out that's like next level stuff.
All right, I'll bring it back to StarCraft. How's that? So
that was amazing. I'm like still trying to like wrap my head around it. Like mastering your own heart, emotional intelligence, and like there is, I think, in a world where things are becoming more and more automated, that is a thing that's becoming more and more important and more valued. And in my line of work, I'm involved in a lot of hiring. I won't get into it too much, but a common theme that I keep seeing coming up, regardless of the type of function or skill that somebody's in, is something around emotional intelligence, something around social awareness, something around knowing yourself and self-awareness, right? Does this person have the capacity to learn? You can't learn unless self-awareness is there, right? And how do you measure somebody for self-awareness? It's a hard thing to do.
Yeah.
10 ladder games, maybe. I don't know.
Stack them up
throw,
against.
throw your applicants into a StarCraft ladder series and see how.
Yeah, make them fight somebody 1,000 MMR better and see what happens. 10 games.
No one deserves that type of punishment.
Oh man. So the next thing I had in here was, that normally we think of StarCraft 2 as a zero variance game, and I've said this a lot on stream. I've said, look, if you win or lose, like whoever walks out of that StarCraft game the victor was the better human in that game. Like they were trickier, faster, more dexterous, smarter, whatever it was in that particular game, right? They were the better human for that 15 minutes or whatever it was. And there's no, you can't bullshit it in any way, right? But at the same time, as I will say, StarCraft is a zero variance game, I will also say that over the course of a ladder session, there is variance, right? So there is the skill of my opponent. There are the particular tendencies of that opponent, right? Is this a cannon rusher? Is this a 12 pooler? Is this a turtle mecher, right? And then there are just the specific decisions that person and you happen to make. And, while I may be a player who has tendencies, I don't do the exact same things in each game, right? There could, the cat could meow and I get distracted and I supply block, right? That's like just random chaos that's injected into the game. So there is that variance across a ladder session where some of the things in this book, which talk about dealing with variance, right, apply even though within a given game, like, yeah, there aren't like coin flips and dice rolls or cards or any of these like random elements. There's still forms of variance if you look at a ladder session, which is how most of us play, right? We don't hop on and play one game of StarCraft. And so to that end, I have a quote from the book. So, results provide immediate feedback on how your decisions are faring, but it's a tricky kind of feedback because winning and losing are only loose signals of decision quality. So this gets into this kind of segues into an interesting concept that Annie calls, and the poker community at large calls, resulting. So I want, if we can, chat, I want to do an exercise together. And if you're listening on the podcast or YouTube or iTunes, you can play along too. I'm going to give you time. Okay? I want everybody to think of your worst decision in recent memory. You can define that time window however you want. It could be a year, past couple months, whatever. Just think of any, it doesn't even have to be your worst one. Think of a really bad decision, right? Does somebody in the chat have one? You don't have to admit your shame. You don't have to out yourself. Just let me know that you thought of one. And then the next thing that I want to do is, can we conjure up your best decision? Maybe over that same time frame or a similar one. And again, it doesn't have to be your best decision either. It could just be, think of something really good, right? Now, this doesn't work as well, right? Because both of these guys have, obviously read the book too, or I would be quizzing Adraseth and LambNRice and asking them to share. But I will say for sure, so I just did, I could share mine. I just did a big job search. My life was all topsy-turvy. And in amongst that, I took a job and that job did not work out. And when I was reading this book, I was like, shit, man, that's my bad decision right there. Oh, that totally didn't work out, and it put me in a bad bind, and I was so nervous about finding another job after that didn't work out, and the job I left before was really pretty good. And, I was doing all this resulting stuff, and then Annie, in the book, hits me immediately with, okay, so I bet what you just thought of was actually not your worst and best decision, but rather your worst and best result in that time frame. Right? And probably anybody who played along in chat or on the podcast did the exact same thing. And I'm like, shit, she's got me. She's totally got me. Because her point is like, if you break down how did you arrive at whatever that was, you probably had some pretty good reasons for it, right? You looked at the evidence, kind of like LambNRice was saying in his example earlier, of like, you get these competing job offers, and it's like, well, one's in a city I've never been in, it pays really well. This one I really like the supervisor, and the other two are more of a known quantity, but they're not as good. And, there's all these variables, right? You probably processed that and did a pretty good job. And if you didn't, you can look at that. But oftentimes we do this resulting thing where we just look at what happened and we go, I should have assumed it was Mutus. I'm a king jackass, right? Like, and it's like, well, no, maybe your opponent sold a really compelling story that it wasn't Mutas, and you actually were playing well, right? You don't want to derail a ladder session over that. So this was really kind of a cool one. I thought it was one of the things that I liked the most in the book, I think.
Well, we know if you ever play LambNRice, it's always
It's
Muta.
always Mutus.
I'm not even gonna sell you something else. It's definitely that.
Yeah, right along with what you're saying here, at the next quote we have from the book is that we tend to have a tendency to equate the quality of decision with the quality of its outcome. Poker players have a word for this, resulting, and it's absolutely right. And again, I think it comes to the pre-programming of the human brain that we're not checking all the variables that actually were related to that decision. Did we win that game or did we lose that game?
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that is so difficult for beginner players or intermediate players and maybe even advanced players. When you do a build and it works and you're like, that's a good build. What you're doing is you're associating the outcome of the game with the build. But the reality is it could have been a terrible build. And you actually see this in like all sorts of cases where a build that probably isn't really good won just because a series of misfortunate events for the other player happened, and maybe unlucky, maybe bad decisions, whatever on their side, but the build wins. And then you now have this association, well, that's a good build, I'm going to do it again. So you do it again. Maybe you win, maybe you lose. But you start to make this association not based on decisions, not based on the information that's objective in the game, but based on the outcome. And that is a dangerous road to walk because it can get you in a mindset of thinking something is actually a good decision when it is not.
Yeah. Twitch chat will follow this real good too, right? You ever lose a game, chat jumps on you, like, oh, well, it's your build. It's obviously your build.
Yeah.
Um,
So this is something I just want to like hear what LambNRice has to say on this, because LambNRice is a big fan. LambNRice does a lot of muta builds, and that's actually kind of, I'm memeing, right? But I'm playing DTs and aside. But I'm doing something similar in that, like, I'm doing one certain thing against all matchups all the time, and so that actually, when we come to StarCraft builds, it kind of does take a little bit of the variability out of it, right? Because if you're always going for mutas, and sometimes you lose with mutas, does that mean mutas are bad? Right? It would lead the person playing to think, well, maybe it's bad decision making. What do you think about that, Lamb?
It's a good question. So Annie talks a lot about, like, in order to measure the quality of decision, you have to kind of backtrack to, like, belief first. Like, what's your belief, and then what's the action, and then what's the result, right? And so one of the beliefs that I have, like, in this game in particular, especially in my Zerg vs Terran, and there's so many people, a lot of Twitch chat GMs who tell me I'm wrong, and they could be right, is that, like, mutas are a terrible decision. My belief is that no, I don't think they are. And there's, to me, there's countless amount of evidence that it's successful. My ZVT win rate's the highest of all three of my matchups, and it's also the one where mutas tend to come out the most. And so I think what I'm playing to, and this is not going to be universally true, is that, like, hey, my macro rhythm when I play that style is very comfortable for me, and whether it be through repetition or whether it be through, like, what the tempo of the game is or whatnot, but, like, I'm trying to play to my strengths in terms of where my comfort zone is, right? And somebody else who's way better than me could do that same build, and the quality of that decision could be horrible, right? The quality of the same exact build for me might be a lot better, right? Eric talked about like there are so many different variables in it. Who's the person? What's their temperament? What's their personality? What's their style? Like these are all parts of the game, and like you have to be honest with yourself and saying like, well, Cyril does so and so. Do I have to do that? Can I do that? Probably
Yeah.
not, right? So like, what's the best answers for yourself? I think is a big part of it, and I think that impacts greatly the quality of your decision.
Makes sense. One thing along those lines that I've heard top commentators say a lot, and even top players, that goes along with this. Cyril does this as a good idea for me. Are things like overlord speed, for example, right? So you get players in gold or platinum going overlord speed. I see Pig coach people out of doing this all the time on his stream. They're
That's interesting.
Yeah, and it's not because it's bad, right? They're buying Ovi speed and never even sending a damn overlord in, or they get to low diamond, right? And they send it in, but they don't have the multitasking to actually look at it, or they get to mid diamond and they send it in, look at it, but their brain can't process the information into anything meaningful, right? So it's like, okay, the good players do this, and they do it. Some of them do it every game, right? Like Dark has gone through phases where he's just like, yeah, no, I'm always getting it. Um, or maybe I'm wrong on the player, but anyway, there are a few Zerks who've done this, right? In any case, it does depend on who you are, what your tendencies are, and maybe even your skill level, right? I mean, for LambNRice, like, I mean, it could be a good enough reason that you think it's fun, right? I
It's
guarantee you,
definitely fun.
I guarantee you're getting better at StarCraft by enjoying the game and playing more frequently than you would be if you did something somebody else told you to do that you thought wasn't that enjoyable.
Yeah, I think having fun is a positive feedback loop that's important if you're going to try to get better.
Yeah,
StarCraft or any other thing.
for sure. So another thing, kind of going along with this resulting concept, is hindsight bias. So hindsight bias is a tendency after an outcome is known to see the outcome as having been inevitable. So this is when we say like, I should have known that would happen, right? Oh God, of course it was Mutas, right? I kind of already gave the example of this. We are succumbing to hindsight bias. So I think we kind of we beat that horse. So moving right along.
Yeah, so the next one, it's one of the things about this book that I really liked is back to a lot of the concepts we've talked about in other podcasts. So if you've listened to all of them straight through or whatever, you probably picked this up. But there's this concept of reflexive and deliberate mind, which is a lot like the self one and self two concept that I think was in inner game of tennis. In that book, the author talks about it in like removing removing the mind that's criticizing so that your trained subconscious could just go in there and do what needs to be done. And so in this book, Annie Duke says, our goal is to get our reflexive minds to execute on deliberate minds' best intentions. Poker players don't need to know the underlying science to understand the difficulty of reconciling two systems. Poker players make multiple decisions with significant financial consequences in a compressed time frame and do it in a way that lassos the reflexive minds to align with their long-term goals. So when you do this sort of training, and I think this is, when we compare this to StarCraft, it's kind of interesting because in StarCraft, for the most part, most of us are just playing ladder. Maybe we occasionally go for a tournament, but we don't have money on the line. So we're not Cyril or Dark or Showtime or Stats or whomever. Our living doesn't depend on us doing well in StarCraft. But all of us want to get better. And so what we're trying to do is we're using deliberate practice to train ourselves so that in times where we're completely overloaded with this information, we make good decisions
Mm-hmm.
because we've trained our mind to make good decisions. And we don't criticize those decisions because we don't have a lot of time, right? This is another thing that comes up later on the book and actual multiple points, but in StarCraft, we know this. StarCraft, you have to make decisions and you do not have a lot of time, especially if you're getting cheesed in the early game. Let's say a cannon rush. Eret does a lot of cannon rushes. For somebody to defend one of Eret's cannon rushes, they need to react correctly and fast. And if they react fast but incorrectly, they lose. If they react correctly but slow, they lose. So it's it's sort of training the brain to, through your practice, to do things automatically under those time pressures, and then not judging yourself while you're doing that training.
Mm-hmm. And a long-term goal here could be I don't want a supply block 10 seconds from now, right? Like that counts as a long-term goal. I think the intuitive thing to think here is, oh, well, I want my MMR to be X in a month, right? But, you know, like lassoing the reflexive mind, per the quote, for a long-term goal could be, well, yeah, there's Ravagers shooting my buildings, right? I am being rushed right now. But in 15 seconds, I would like to be producing additional units. I need to have a reflex that is pulling me very strongly to look away and build a pylon right now. Or to grab a probe from somewhere that is on my screen and build a pylon somewhere, right? So I think this really, for me, hit home in terms of like the StarCraft experience, right? It's like every fiber of my being that's just like a meat bag wants to do one thing, but I need to like make that do something that is consistent with my long-term goals.
Yeah, it's like when you're getting attacked, I have to survive, I have to survive, I have to defend. That's the number one priority, and absolutely it is. But guess what? Like, if you haven't been larva injecting while that's been happening, you're going to die 5 minutes from now. So,
Yep.
like, you have to stack your priorities, yes, but you have to scratch the other itch on your back, too.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's important.
And this is why you're so much better at the game than me, LambNRice. I saw you in a game. I think it was against. Well, we won't say his name. It gives Voldemort power if you say his name. But the A word. You're fighting the A word, and
There may have been mech units.
there were some mech units constructed, but also, and I shit you not, probably about every 3 seconds, LambNRice is hearing that a nuke is incoming, right? And I watched this man inject every single base. And I was like, how the hell does he like and he's still pulling workers away from these nukes and like handling it and finding them like, how on earth does this guy do this? Like so yeah, I was very blown away.
Maybe that's even a bad habit at that point. Like, my larva count was probably like 100 larvae across the map, but it was like the hands just take over. It's like, what is it called? Like the devil's hands, idle hands, or whatever. They just start doing the thing that you've trained them to do through like punishing
Mm.
losses, right? So the
Mm-hmm.
feedback from all of those losses were never enough larvae, never enough larvae, never enough larvae, and then it has slowly bubbled its way up to the top of the priorities list over time of painful losses by not having enough larvae and having like thousands of resources in the bank.
Yeah.
So good. What you just said is so good. And here is why LambNRice is Masters One GM, and whoever is listening is not. Because LambNRice just said it. It's so beautifully perfect. The negative feedback he got made him practice something, and that came up to identify a problem, practice it until it was automatic, deliberate practice until it was automatic, and played enough games until now it just happens. And so, in the case of Intergame of Tennis, Self 2 it takes over. And it doesn't matter if there's nukes on the field or battle cruisers or whatever. Self 2 just does that. And now the brain power to deal with, like, oh, this is a situation I don't know, it's freed up. And he can then deal with situations that are unusual. And this goes to defending cheese and stuff, right? So if you get all in early game and you lose to something, well, you probably lost to it because you've not seen it enough times. And maybe you've seen it enough times, but you haven't practiced the right thing to defend against it. And maybe you've seen it enough times and you don't know what the right thing is, but basically you haven't practiced the automated response that you need to do in the correct time to solve that puzzle. And just like you're saying, you might survive, but then die 5 minutes later. And so that's like, oh, well, okay, you can see progress, right? Because sometimes cheese gets you and you're just dead. Sometimes cheese gets you and you survive and then you die 5 minutes later. And sometimes cheese gets you and you survive and you die 25 minutes later. And so it's this sort of, you have to practice so many different things. But if you're not taking that negative feedback and using it to improve and using to identify problems, you will not make it to that level of play.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting what you said. It's like it becomes like automatic, and then it frees up your mind to do the other things. And like everybody who picks up the game of StarCraft for the first time, they're always like, wow, this is a strategy game. It's a strategy. I can put my brain into this thing and all these beautiful ideas are going to open up and I'm going to do some stuff that nobody's ever seen. Like everybody who's ever like
Yeah.
purchased the game is thinking that for sure the moment they pick it up. What they fail to realize is that thing doesn't occur until way down the line at some point if you've managed to like grind hard enough. But like the critical thinking of part of your brain that like gets accessed or unlocked, like it only happens if you've done the deliberate practice, if you've done the other things right. Then suddenly, like Address just said, it like opens up your ability to think about the problem and address it, right? And I still struggle with this. There are definitely moments where I'm like, I can't even start to process the problem that I'm about to face because I have all these other priorities that, you know, I didn't do well enough in the course of an ugly game. But the moments when it does happen, it's like some of the most like beautiful fucking things ever.
Yeah, for sure. What's funny about that too is like that dream that everybody has when they like picked up the box, right? You're like, oh, I'm gonna be a strategy lord, right? It's not that it's not true. It's that they're not factoring in that somebody could have a very, very worse strategy and execute it 100 times better than them and win, right? Like, you could take somebody who's bronze and I guarantee you I can kill them with just zealots. Like, that's not gonna be hard, right? And like any of us could do this, right? Any of us who've invested time into the game. So it's, you know, it's not like a totally ill-advised thing. It's just they haven't totally internalized what an RTS is, right? They're thinking, oh, strategy game. Well, there's two other letters in front of that have something to say about your beautiful plan, buddy. So just to kind of sum up the reflexive deliberative mind thing, so one more quote here. In addition, once the game is over, players must learn from that jumbled mass of decisions and outcomes, separating the luck from the skill, the signal from the noise, and guarding against resulting. That is the only way to improve, especially when those same under pressure situations will recur in a variety of forms.
I wanna make a point here that I think is very common in poker. You can easily separate the newer players or less experienced or poor mindset players from the I made money today, I did great, to the other players who don't think about the result. They could have lost money for all they care, but they say, hey, I am really proud of this decision. I think I played this thing really well. This and this happened amazing. Those same players will say, yeah, you know, I made a good bit of money today. However, and Annie Duke talks about Phil Ivey when they were talking about this. Phil, despite still winning, said he was quick to criticize all his poor decisions despite winning, right? And I think that is really interesting and a good way to think about it, because when I have a ladder session and I see the match history is all green, I don't do that. I am basking in the glory of taking down fellow
Look at
nerds.
how good I am.
Yeah, 100%. And then when it's all red, I'm like, I can't shut the stream off fast enough, right? And I definitely am a victim to this, and I need to think about the habits that I'm creating while doing this. And it's really cool to see that the people who are super successful have the habit of, let me be really, really particular about like why, what I did, how I did it, and what improvements are there. Where are the room for improvements?
Right. So I'm bouncing in my chair here because I have the quote about Phil Ivey that LambNRice is referencing. So I just jumped down in the notes. So the quote is, so he wins a big tournament. That's like the backdrop for this, right? So after Phil Ivey's win, he and my brother went to a restaurant for dinner, during which Ivey deconstructed every potential playing error he thought he might have made on the way to victory, asking my brother's opinion about each strategic decision. A more run-of-the-mill player might have spent the time talking about how great they played, relishing in the victory. So I noted here that I actually do this with my replays. This is one where I read it in the book. I'm like, man, look at me. I already had this one, right? So, of course, simultaneously not doing the thing that I'm patting myself on the back for doing, right? Because I'm relishing in the victory of not relishing in the victory. A very, very meta moment there. But yeah, so I was patting myself on the back for not patting myself on the back here. But, you know, oftentimes I will do replay analysis after winning a game because I know, like I remember from 2 minutes ago in the game, oh shit, I sent these hallucinations out, didn't look at what they saw. Could have been mutas. Again, we're back to the mutas, right? And my build in
It was
PvZ,
mutas.
yeah, like my build straight loses if it's mutas and I don't know. And there are games where I'm like, I'm on the high. I'm like, man, I adepted the shit out of this person. I'm feeling good. I killed 18 drones with 7 adepts, whatever. And I don't check. I'm like, they have nothing. I'm going to go kill them. This is going to be great, right? So I will always try to call myself on it if I have one of those. And likewise, I try to do the inverse of it and kind of pluck out, maybe you had a hard loss. Is there something that happened that you did right? You know what I mean? Like, is there something you've been working on, you've been trying to get? Maybe don't screw up this one little part. Don't get this one supply block you always get, that you can kind of invert this and get that sort of feel good out of it.
Yeah,
It's
I like that. I like the lens that you wear in a loss is what's the silver lining, and then the lens you wear in a win is what mistakes were made. Like
Mm-hmm.
where can I still improve? And it's
I
like
think
that
that's
mental like framework is really.
I think that's the huge advantage of the um, focus goal setup that Eret does, is it sets you up for that sort of mentality that every loss still is something good, and every win still has learning potential.
Mm-hmm.
So back to the book.
Yeah.
The world is a pretty random place. The influence of luck makes it impossible to predict exactly how things will, and all the hidden information makes it even worse. If we don't change our mindset, we're going to have to deal with it deal with being wrong a lot. It's built into the equation. Again, this comes back to a lot of the things we're hammering on, and Annie Duke hammers on in this book a lot, is incomplete information. You cannot control incomplete information, and if you don't accept that, you are not going to be a happy person. you are going to be a grumpy person, because you're just going to continuously blame the world for your mistakes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's back to the mindset management being like the most important thing, right? Or at least it is a key ingredient. I think we're building up these different layers of like, you have to have this bag of different skills to be able to improve. Which, what's neat about that is anybody who has improved at StarCraft has some amount of these things, or has ticked a few of the boxes at least, or they grinded for a billion hours, one of the two.
Mm-hmm. And this leads into something that I recall Artosis more than once, at least in a cast or in some of his other content that he's created, is that sometimes you don't have to be right, but you have to be decisive to win. And often you'll see this in reference to really high level players, that a decisive move will win a game rather than the right move. And that is because they don't have complete information. So if you take the best player in the world, arguably Serral, uh, Serral might make a choice that's wrong, but still win the game.
Yeah.
And that is because at the time, with the information given, that was probably the best decision that Serral could have made, and therefore that's the decision was made, and he went with it. But in the same way, you can lose from doing that because you don't have complete information.
Yep.
I want to make a quick point to that. It's like sometimes the quote says something around like a decisive thing is better than a not decisive thing. Not being decisive about something and not doing something, that's a decision too.
Yeah.
Right? That is you. It doesn't have to be conscious, right? Like you refusing to act on something in and of itself is a decision, right? And that too has an outcome. So like training your mind to make decisions is, I think, the key takeaway here. You're just like, whether I make a decision or not, there's going to be an outcome. So let's treat everything as a decision and learn how to make them and be decisive about them.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. It's more of an awareness of how things are, right? Like, hey, this is the world. You can let this happen to you, or you can take the reins, right? Like, which one do you want? So keeping with the thread of decision making, right? There's this concept that decisions are a bet on the future, and there is an opportunity cost, right? So this is kind of like what LambNRice is saying. If I'm presented with A or B, I'm losing something by not picking B. I'm losing something by not picking A, or I'm losing something by not picking either one of them because I couldn't figure it out fast enough, right? And so this is kind of the problem that StarCraft uniquely surfaces that a lot of other games don't, because of the way that it forces decisions on you within a certain time frame, or really forces you to make them as quickly as you can, because it's essentially competitive decision making, right?
That's an interesting way to put it. Competitive decision making.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I noted in the book, as again I was reading and thinking about it, is there's this idea of ignorance not being a bad thing. And I think personally this is the book goes into talk about scientists, and I'm a scientist, so I got really all excited about it. But there in my experience, in my field, you know, in my job field in science, as you get more trained and you become more and more of an expert, you do realize how little you know about the world, right? When you take an introductory science course and the instructor says, this is the way that something is, you know, they're giving you the basics, the foundation, so that you can understand it. But the reality is, yeah, most of the time this is the way it is. And then there's these weird outliers that we know of in nature. And you can do this in any field. It could be physics, it could be biology, it could be chemistry, it doesn't matter. And this is actually something that we embrace in my job, right? We embrace the fact that we don't know things, and then that spurs questions, and that spurs observations, it spurs hypothesis, it spurs testing, and it spurs like investigation. It spurs the scientific method. And really to be super analytical, and I think a lot of people that play StarCraft are the analytical types. There's so many people in StarCraft and in Twitch chat that are devs. It's kind of hilarious to me. But you can tell because that's the kind of mindset that a dev has. You have this logical mind that, you know, you put things together. And so ignorance isn't necessarily a bad thing. If you are making decisions and you don't have complete information, and then you can analyze that decision based on what you had as information at the time, and then accept that you were ignorant of certain things, you can use that as a great and impressive learning tool. And so this is why looking at the replays is so critically important, right? Because if you just do the thing of resulting and you're just saying, well, I won that game, so that must have been a good decision, it may not be. And you're ignoring actually a big learning tool.
When you say it's better to be ignorant in those scenarios, is that suggestive of like it's better to have known unknowns than unknown unknowns? Is that like kind of the thesis? Yeah.
That's a Donald Rumsfeld quote for everybody that's young to know that. It's better to accept that you are, so it's worse, at least in, let's say in my field, or in earth science, you are putting yourself at a disadvantage to sort of arrogantly think you understand everything in a system that you are studying, right? And a system could be, let's say, the Pacific Ocean. Let's say you're an oceanographer, you study the Pacific Ocean. If you have the opinion that you understand and know all the unknowns, that will bias you. It will unequivocally bias you. We already, like humans are already, and that will bias you even more. However, if you accept that there are things you don't understand and you don't know, that is like on the path to becoming objective. And so the book actually does do this in many places. It talks about objective job fields like science and judges, right? So like lawyers and things like that. And we're biased. We're biased. Even though I have gone through extensive training not to be biased, I am biased. Yeah. And not accepting that, not knowing that, is worse than accepting it and knowing it. So like it's the acceptance of that ignorance, I think, that is really important.
Didn't Annie write something around typically the smarter somebody is, the more biased they're likely to?
I'm glad you asked. They have
a higher chance.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because somewhere in these show notes there is a line that says being smart makes it worse. Makes it worse. I will go ahead and just read those quotes out.
I'm forcing you to jump around.
No, this is
good talk.
You're actually validating my amazing note taking. This is what you're doing, LambNRice.
These are sick notes, by the way.
I'm totally.
Those of you who are listening and viewing, you can't see them, but this is sick.
Yeah, I'm over here just sledgehammering the fourth wall. Sorry, everybody. Um, well, while we're at it, I mean, do you just want to take one of these out, Seth? We've got a couple of them.
Yeah, I mean, I can start us off with this. I think jumping down to the smarter is better. It's actually pertinent to the discussion. So
Totally, yeah.
Annie writes in the book, the popular wisdom is that the smarter you are, the less susceptible you are to fake news or disinformation. After all, smart people are more likely to analyze and effectively evaluate where the information is coming from, right? But
Yeah,
I can tell you, I know, absolutely have experienced this.
yeah,
We smart people in our ivory tower in the universities, we are quick to dismiss because we're smart.
yep,
And we'll be like, well, that's BS. So we'll just not even acknowledge it. We'll not even consider it.
yeah.
And it is a terrible habit. And maybe I'm a little bit lucky. I'm not saying that I don't fall into this, because I think that I do fall into these biases. I'm a little bit lucky in that my dad is an engineer, or was before he retired. And so one of the things that I was instilled with is you have to listen to the opposition before you can make a decision. And this is sort of related to it, right? That if you are not considering all the different points, if you think, especially I mean, this is off the rails a little bit for fake news, but if you think that somebody's viewpoint is wrong and you just say, well, that's wrong and I'm not going to accept it, that is not solving the problem. That is not helping you grow. That is not helping you understand this issue, and it creates bias in you. And if you think that they're the enemy, then you should know about the enemy. You need to learn why the enemy is that way. And this is a concept in art of war, or in military applications, is that you must understand your enemy in order to best them. And this is, if we relate it back to StarCraft, which is what this is all about, if you do not understand what your opponent is doing and you just assume it's bad and dismiss that information, it is not going to turn out well for you in most cases. And this happens. I've talked about it on my stream, in that when I was gold, platinum, I would see somebody do something and I'd say, oh, that's just a bad build. They must be bad at StarCraft, because I'm good at StarCraft and I know what I'm doing. And then I go and lose to something that was a proxy, and there you go. So I made an early decision a couple of years ago of, no matter what my opponent is doing, I just assume they're better than me and that what they're doing is good. And then I can react to it.
I need this lesson. I played a game on ladder about 2 days ago, and I was cannon rushing a Protoss, and I thought that they had raged and walked away from the computer. So did the Twitch chat, and we were just having a grand old time talking
The
a bunch of
memes
shit.
were coming out.
Yeah. So here's what my opponent did. Okay. They completely dead fished their whole base. Like they had a full worker line going. They let the ones that were on the side where there weren't cannons keep mining. They let the ones on the side where there were cannons just run into them and die. They turned their scouting probe around to some random ass corner of the map, and they built a new nexus. And when that nexus was done, they boxed whatever probes weren't dead, moved them into a corner, and recalled them. And then they killed me with a void ray that they'd chronoed out of the Stargate that they'd constructed over there. Yep.
GG, well played.
Yeah, GG, dude. Yeah, so I need this lesson pretty bad. So to sum up the being smart can make it worse thing, another quote. So, surprisingly, being smart can actually make bias worse. The smarter you are, the better you are at constructing a narrative that supports your beliefs, rationalizing and framing the data to fit your argument or point of view. We'll circle back to this in a little bit when we talk about truth-seeking pods, but I definitely realized this kind of a while ago about myself, and I work hard to opt out of doing it. It doesn't mean that I am successful, right? But I call this the am I full of shit check, right? It's like I feel like I could feel the gears turning, me constructing an argument for why what I'm hearing is wrong, right? And I do the same thing Adraseth is talking about, right? I, very, very dismissive of things that I'm like, oh, no, that's dumb, right? This gets me in trouble in my relationship all the time. Like, Adeline will be right about something. And I'm like, nah, you don't know what you're talking about. I already thought all the implications through, whatever. And, like, almost invariably, right? She has information that I don't, and I needed to listen more, right? Um, but I try to catch this and just do the, okay, let's take a quick step back. Am I deluding myself? Do I have any reason to want to believe the thing that I'm arguing for, right? Or are there any extraneous things that are making me discredit the person who's disagreeing with me, right? Like, am I full of shit right now? That story I told on stream for people who were there last week, uh, that was one of those. I told this story about me getting angry at a person in real life, and me in the Twitch chat had a big discussion about whether I was the asshole or not. That's an am I full of shit check, right? It's like, I've constructed a narrative in my head that says the other person's the asshole, right? But let's just do some truth seeking about that.
It's so funny. Like when when you have your like high school or university debate team, right? Like one of the exercises that they're supposed to do is like, okay, you've made your argument. If you had to make the argument against yourself,
Mm-hmm.
what would it be? So construct the other narrative,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you see this in StarCraft too, because you see streamers always ask themselves when they take a huge lead, they ask the question, okay, how do I lose this game?
Yes.
Right, and it's the perfect question to
Mm-hmm.
ask. So you're asking them to critically think about like, okay, how many times can this game play out, and if it plays out 1,000 times and I lose one, what does that game look like?
Mm-hmm.
Let me make sure I cover that base, right? And I think it's just such a good just check yourself question to ask when you play this game.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that I've learned to do when facing cheese. So people who lose to cheese, I used to lose to cheese a lot. Now I'm much more robust against cheese. Um, so so first you learn what the cheeses are, then you start defending those cheeses, then you start defending those cheeses macro, and you get to this point that okay, now you probably have a lead if you defended the cheese and you did your macro properly, but you still got to go over there and kill them to win the game. And you usually can't just do it right away because maybe your army is too small or something. And so it's something that asking the question of how can I now lose this game? I am ahead. Everybody knows I'm ahead. The opponent knows I'm ahead. But how can I lose this game? And in PvP, as we all know, if we play Protoss, there's a ton of different types of cheeses and proxies and all sorts of shady things that go on in PvP. And a lot of times it's like, okay, if a cannon rush failed, you defended it and you're pretty well off and you know you're in the lead. What can you lose to? Void rays, DTs, right? Those are common follow-ups. And that also happens in long macro games where it's like, okay, what's the thing that can kill me? Now, obviously, I don't do it enough. I could do better at it, but it's something that helped me get out of the rut of losing. Like every time there was an early pressure, early attack, really cheesy type of play, I would lose to it and I'd be really frustrated, or I'd defend it and then I'd lose later on and be like, well, that's bullshit. But it really comes to posing that question of what's the thing that now I know I'm in a good spot, but like let's not get that ego involved, right? Let's stay grounded and say what can lose me this game, because I can still make bad decisions, and ignoring information is a bad decision.
Yep.
And that could be one of them.
Yeah, it's back to not processing is processing, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'll take it back to the book again.
Yeah, sounds good.
So by treating decisions as bets, poker players explicitly recognize that they are deciding each with benefits and risks. They also recognize that there's no simple answers. Some of the things are unknown or unknowable. The promise of this book is that we follow the example of poker players by making explicit that our decisions are bets. We can make better decisions and anticipate and take protective measures when irrationality is likely to keep us from acting in our best interest.
So
This, I think,
there's one little bit where you cut out, your audio cut out. So the beginning of that quote, I'll recap. So by treating decisions as bets, poker players explicitly recognize that they are deciding on alternative futures, and then the rest of it I think came through fine for everybody.
So the I think this comes from kind of early on in the book. It's a part of the the book, as we have identified in many of these books, of the let's convince you this is a
Yes.
problem part of the book. But it just, again, we're getting back to this, the mentality of what these decisions are and how to treat these decisions when you are limited in information is extremely important, right? So if you haven't gotten that by this point in the podcast, I don't know what to tell you, right? Like we are really covering, but it's so very important that, and poker players, I think one of the things that we haven't talked about yet, and I think we're going to talk about just kind of the next bit here, is that in poker there is this, so like losing in StarCraft feels bad, but we're not going to be homeless if we lose in StarCraft. If your life is poker and you consistently make bad decisions, you will lose all your money and you will be in big trouble, right?
It's the one job out there where you can go broke.
Yeah,
Right.
true.
and
Yeah,
and
that's
so the stakes being higher, I think, helps with the decision making. Actually, it helps ability to process information and start to think objectively.
I'm curious again, kind of going back to LambNRice mentioning, that poker is something you dabble in, at least, as maybe a more
As a filthy casual.
sure, yeah, more casual player, right? But like, um, obviously it's, if you're doing it at all, it's an interest, right? So I'm curious how, what kind of parameters have you put around that? Does poker live in a certain box for you? Do you only play certain stakes, or with a certain, amount of money per amount of time, or like how you set that up, if you don't mind sharing, anyhow?
Yeah, I don't. I think the parameters are loose, for better or worse.
Mm-hmm.
Like the amounts that I might play for have probably gone up, as has my income over the last. I was introduced to the game back in 2004 ish. So like poker had a big boom, and this is like a quick poker history. Poker had a big boom in 2003, 2004, when an amateur won the World Series of Poker.
Mm.
He had like qualified online. His name was Chris Moneymaker.
Yeah.
That's actually his name.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
and ESPN had broadcasted it, and online poker was becoming a thing. It was legal, and so all of those things, all of those different like details spiraled together to create just this massive interest in poker, right? And so I had just like entered college at the time, and so many people were getting into it. We're playing for like $5, $10 a night, and it was interesting to learn uh, why certain people were winning all the time and why certain people were losing all the time. It's luck if it happens a couple of times,
Mm-hmm.
but if it keeps happening consistently, luck runs out for everybody, right? Unless you believe in superstition, unless you're somebody who believes highly in luck, I'm not, then you're going to think that like there's got to be some other reason here
Yep.
why these people consistently come out ahead. Oh, are they making better, folds before the flop? Are they putting in less money when they have questionable scenarios? Um, and you enter communities of people who have differing beliefs, some of whom will say, that's bullshit, it's this, the deck was, it wasn't shuffled enough, or there's a lot of luck involved. And then there's this other band of people that you're also exposed to that said things like, yeah, this decision seems questionable now, but if you play this thing out 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, even though I'm far behind in the situation, the amount of money that I stand to win actually makes this a good decision. And it's weird because you're like, well, you were 27% to win this hand. And, they introduced an idea of pot odds, which is depending on the amount of money you commit versus the amount of money you stand to gain. Actually, at 27% win rate, that's a winning scenario.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, when I heard advice like that, it made me think like, okay, there's something to this. It's more of a science than it is an art. And there's less luck involved than I originally thought. And that's kind of what got me interested in it.
Mm-hmm.
That was a long-winded introduction to poker, by the way.
No, that's really good.
This is
Yeah,
probably
it's
a segue for a later point for the truth pods, by the way, but we can hold off on that.
um, so one section that we haven't touched on a lot yet. We've actually mapped out a fair amount of the book already. Um, but the sort of subtitle for it is the stubbornness of beliefs. For me, this really maps onto a lot of the self narrative that we get into, this is like where I think balance binding comes from, which we've touched on that concept a fair bit tonight. The quote is, once a belief is lodged, it becomes difficult to dislodge. It takes on a life of its own, leading us to notice and seek out evidence confirming our belief, rarely challenge the validity of confirming evidence, and ignore or work hard to actively discredit information contradicting the belief. This irrational, circular information processing pattern is called motivated reasoning. The way that we process new information is driven by the beliefs we hold, strengthening them. Those strengthened beliefs then drive how we process further information, and so on. So you have this just cycle of shit where you are reinforcing and reinforcing and reinforcing that obviously Terran is Imba, and that's why I lost this game, and blah 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 blah. I hate Widow Mines, right? So, this is something to be aware of, and again, kind of as Adderseth, eloquently pointed out, like all these books have the let me convince you this is a big bad scary problem, right? This is kind of one of those, right? I read this like long paragraph, and I'm like, oh shit, how do I not have the downward spiral? I don't want that, right? So don't worry, it's coming. Everything's gonna be okay, as it always is with these books.
Yeah, I think one of the themes of just being biased keeps coming up, right? Like, I don't think that word is actually in that quote, but it's easy to see that like people tend to be biased towards their own beliefs. Nobody wants to call their own beliefs into question, right? And like Annie Duke talks about like the 3-step process of learn the thing, believe the thing, and then only when it's challenged do I research and discover if that thing is right or wrong,
Mm-hmm.
right? Whereas the order should be learn the thing, challenge the thing, and then get to a place where I know if that thing is validated or not.
Yes.
And I think it's like the human condition. Like, I don't think anybody is innocent of that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like a good mind frame to have when you play StarCraft. You're like, is my build actually solid?
Yeah.
I know other people do that, but like, what's going on here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, but you're supposed to expand first. You're supposed to get on 3 bases. I did those things, and yet I lost, right?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you have to like go even further back and say, wait, are the foundation blocks like just a little bit off, or are they the wrong blocks to
Mm-hmm.
begin with? Should I think about this differently?
Yep.
And
Yeah,
this
that's
happened to the author, right? She got advice from her brother, had these hands that she was playing, and anybody who played anything other than that list she thought was bad. And this is exactly what happened to her. She had
mm-hmm.
got her motivated reasoning that she was doing it the right way because she trusted her source, and
Right.
there's the bias.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so another one of the tools that she kind of offers to kind of help escape from this trap is this concept of just viewing things as a bet, right? So you feel really confident about whatever your idea is, and then your friend's like, "Hey, you want to bet?" Right? And all of a sudden, you're thinking about it a little different, right? You're like, how sure am I that such and such movie won the award for whatever? Like you start kind of scrutinizing it a little bit more. So she talks about, and we'll get into some of these, the ways in which you can kind of trigger. So it's funny because it sounds like she's suggesting that you just gamble on everything, which is like kind of what you'd expect from a poker book. But that's not what she means. She's talking about just turning on the circuitry of a bet and using that as a framework, because it being a bet flips your brain into a different type of calculation that your brain is kind of good at, where you bullshit yourself a bit less than you would if you're just kind of like running your own little mental narrative. And so some of what that framework for finding certainty looks like, the following checklist. It's like, how do I know this? Where did I get this information? What is the quality of my sources? How much do I trust them? How up to date is my information? What could I be missing, right? And she goes on and on. This is just kind of a sampling, but these are the kinds of questions that you start to ask yourself when you view something in the framework of a bet or of assigning value to your certainty.
Right. And that leads into this concept of assigning a value to your decisions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so poker players do this like quite literally by how much are you going to put on that hand? We don't do it in StarCraft, but we could do it. And I thought this was a really interesting thing in terms of actually just in life about what your beliefs are and what your biases are. And so from the book, what if in addition to expressing what we believe, we also rated our level of confidence about the belief on a scale of 0 to 10? A 0 to 10 scale translates directly to percentages. Oh, Siri, go away.
So let me reread. You cut out again, and maybe we could just have me take quotes, because for some reason this keeps happening. Um, so the quote is, "What if, in addition to expressing what we believe, we also rated our level of confidence about the accuracy of our belief on a scale of 0 to 10? It also translates directly to percentages."
I really like this because I think it introduces the idea that confidence is a part of decision making, right? And if we are able to call it out, decisions are suddenly not as binary as they used to be. Like it's not just like do it or don't do it, right or wrong. It's do it, but I have lower confidence in it. And
Mm-hmm.
so like you're not as floored about the result when it doesn't go favorably for you. And then that actually gives you good calibration in terms of, hey, am I being overconfident or underconfident in some of the things? And I think that like actually introduces you to like what the truth actually is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
This is a thing we do in science too. Right? We use statistics to assign confidence to our information. So you quite literally cannot get something published in science unless you've done some sort of statistics to it to back up your claim. So we need math to back up those claims. And it might be less familiar to people, but even using it in everyday life of like if you heard something and you're repeating that information to someone else, you might not be completely 100% certain about it.
Yeah, totally. So the next section is about outcomes being feedback, and the quote is, "How we figure out what we should learn from an outcome becomes another bet. As an outcome comes our way, figuring out whether those outcomes were caused mainly by luck or mainly by the predictable result of particular decisions we made is a bet of great consequence. If we determine our decisions drove the outcome, we can feed the data we get following those decisions back into belief formation and updating, creating a learning loop." So this is kind of interesting. Basically, she has kind of a diagram. Sorry, I don't have it for those watching live with us on Twitch, but maybe it's for the best for the podcast folks. So basically, the way this works is you have a belief that feeds into a bet that you make, which then gives you an outcome that you can feed into subsequent bets. So that's kind of the naive version of this. A better version of it is that same thing, except at the end, you either feed that information into a subsequent bet or you put it into the luck pile. So you're like, oh, well, this was actually just something going my way and it shouldn't have. This was, the confluence of circumstance or my opponent making a mistake or, these kinds of things. And being able to do that sifting accurately helps you create a better loop for informing decisions into the future.
And this is like it's essentially a method of learning if you think about it, right? It's like what explicitly saying what we can do to improve our decision making, right? We're taking information and passing it through this system and then improving and iterating on that, which is and the information we're getting directly from, right? As long as you're watching replays and you're acknowledging it, not just playing the game, because there is the playing the game side of it, but you have to get feedback, which is the watching the replays. You can just input that information back into this loop, and then the next time you can try again and see where that takes you, right? When you're in those similar situations.
Mm-hmm.
How do you
Yes.
think you're able to call something luck in those scenarios versus not, right? Like identifying it as luck is a really difficult thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like we can go back to the resulting example of like when you lose, you can say bad luck. And when you win, you can say it was all me.
Yep.
So like I think you have to remove that part, but I think that's the tricky thing about like figuring out like where was luck actually an ingredient here. And sometimes it could be when you lose. You could lose based on
Mm-hmm.
bad luck. It is a reasonable outcome to think about. Um,
I find that really interesting that you bring that up because that in my head, that's actually not that difficult to discern, but it for me it only can come from replays in StarCraft. Like if we're
Mm.
just talking about StarCraft, it only come from, and I can give you two very pertinent recent examples. One, I was playing a game PvP, and once again, I'm only building stalkers and DTs. At this point, I was doing a one base attack with stalkers, and I went over to the opponent's base, and there were many immortals and many zealots, and I immediately got just shreked by those units because stalkers do not fare particularly well against a lot of immortals and zealots. And I thought, boy, that's really weird. My attack was hitting at 5 minutes or 4:45 or something. It was quite early. Why did they have all these immortals? Like, what is this build? I watched the replay, and the opponent had no information, no scouting on me, but the build the opponent went for was
Mm.
two Robo Chrono Immortals. I've never seen that in PvP. Really interesting. Like what that's very creative, but literally would die to any Stargate play, right? Because you build like one Void Ray and the game is over because
Right.
there was only one other gate to build something that shoots up, and there were no cannons or anything like that. So wow, what a huge risk that player took. It paid off for them. Do I think that is a consistently winning build in PvP? Absolutely not, because Stargate play is pretty common. I don't do it particularly because I've confined myself to playing a certain way. But unless they were doing it just against me, I think that that is a lucky scenario for the opponent.
Mm.
Now, would it mean that I would still win that game or my decision making was good in that game? No, probably not. My micro was pretty off. I made some mistakes with my warp prism and so on. But still, I think that that game I lost to luck. Another one that I can recall is a game where I think the opponent something weird happened and the opponent was did some cheese, and so I went across the map and made a proxy, and I thought I was super cool and like haha, I'm gonna proxy you and like kill you with a bunch of units, and they totally countered it. And I was like, how did they where are these? It was a Zerg, and it was like all these roaches, and I'm like, why did they make all these roaches? There was nothing to indicate that I was going to do what I was doing. Go watch the replay, and the path of one of their overlords, which was kind of an unusual path, happened to cross over just the edge of a probe. They then scouted a little further, saw what I was building, but I didn't see the overlord,
Mm.
and that was the game. And so the overlord pathing was not like something I would have expected, but it was there in the game, and they saw what I was doing, and that led them winning. Was any of their other scouting very good? Not particularly. They actually didn't know what I was doing inside my base. So, ironically, if that overlord had never seen that proxy, I probably would have won because they probably would have droned instead of making units. And so those are the type of scenarios. I mean, it's maybe more like really obvious. Doesn't mean the player's bad. I don't think that the opponent was bad. It just means that that scenario and my decision making, maybe at 7 out of 10 games it works, and then there's those three where an unusual scout or an unusual path of one unit happens to get you loss.
Yeah, it's interesting. I love the question that you posed, LambNRice. I feel like I think I buy Adra's answer here. But I think it's a very insightful question. Like,
Is it motivated reasoning that
well, see, that's the thing, right? You had me a little more with your first story because the second one, while I found myself nodding along, sounds a little bit like the I lost because my opponent's bad, right? Which actually, okay, here let's go meta again. I feel like the discussion that we're having right now is like the truth seeking thing, and so LambNRice brought this up earlier. This is like I feel like the meat of the book, right? Because there's always the format of all right, I'm going to scare you about this thing being a problem. I'm going to convince you that I have all the answers and you need my self help book. And then I'm going to give you the tools, right? And so we've talked about some of the mechanisms, some of the little brain switches you can flip. But I think the biggest one, for me at least, the big takeaway, the big like, and this is now what you go out and do because you read Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke, is the truth seeking pod. So if you guys don't mind jump into that, I think this would be a good one to dive into.
Yeah, I think that's we can sort of wrap up with this and then maybe take questions after we do the truth seeking because this
Yeah.
is towards the end of the here.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that as we've established in this in the book and throughout the show here today, is that we have a lot of bias. Humans are just tendency to bias is quite high, and in order to reduce that and get rid of it and try to combat it, you can create these truth-seeking pods, as she calls in the book, or groups, or whatever you want to call them. But the idea is to try and sort of reduce all that bias that we have, because for whatever reason, it's easier to be objective when you look at somebody else's mistakes than your own, probably because you take ownership of them in some way. So we're trying to reduce that. And one of the quotes from the book, I'm going to get out of order, Eric, but you can, I know you'll
Sure.
hang.
Yeah.
If we can find a few people to choose for to form a truth-seeking pod to help us with the hard work connected to finding the truth, it'll move the needle just a little bit, but with improvements that accumulate and compound over time. In other words, if we get people that give us criticism and we're willing to take that criticism, and then we give them criticism back, we're sort of combating that bias. And the more we do that over time, will make us just better people. Just in general, just better people. It's a good thing to do.
Right, and the compounding over time is super important, right? You don't even need to do that good of a job. If you just scoop up like a few percent more of these lessons compared to the average StarCraft player by doing this with your little play group or your people you trust, you're going to be, a year from now so far ahead of people who aren't doing this. So one other quote here is that this means agreeing to be open-minded to those who disagree with us, giving credit where it's due, taking responsibility where it's appropriate, even and especially when it makes us uncomfortable. And we need to make clear that the social contract is being modified, or feelings will get hurt and defensiveness will rear its ugly head. So, kind of basic, super high level framework for this: focus on accuracy, rewarding objectivity and open mindedness within kind of the social contract of your group, and you have to have accountability, right? So if Addressa says, I only won because my opponent's bad, I gotta be like, I don't know about that one, right?
Motivated reasoning.
Yeah, but to be clear, I'm doing the bad thing now because we didn't explicitly agree to have a truth-seeking experience, right? If you come at somebody with this and you don't have that social contract cleared with them, it's not going to go well, right? So don't just like spring this on your significant other.
Twitch chat.
Yeah.
This is the mistake Twitch chat makes a lot.
I saw LambNRice grin big at that one.
Yeah.
I have so many thoughts that I'm trying to collect and like say in a smart way. When you watch a replay of your own loss, like you're getting value from it, right? You're like trying to figure out your lesson and you're trying to pinpoint what you did wrong. You're trying to identify if it's luck or if it's not, or how much luck was involved. And you're looking at these things. It's helpful. I think it is a good exercise to do. I think the value that you get in having an objective third party who's aligned to getting you better at the game look at your replays is worth like 100x that. It's like if you're grading your own homework, right? And you're saying like, yeah, like here's probably the places I could have done better. Da, 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 da. It's still your own homework, right? Like there's probably something in you that is going to be less critical or critical in the wrong places because you're too close to it, right? Like an author writes a book and they wrote their first draft and they're like, hey, I need somebody to proofread this and edit this. They can't do it themselves, right? It's too close to home. You look at something this close, like you're not going to be able to interpret the truth as easily as somebody who hasn't seen it ever is going to do, right? And so like, I think about it from the perspective of like, Annie Duke talks about how she goes to her brother for advice. He's objective and he cares about her outcomes. He's the perfect person to go to. He's also happens to be a professional at the game. Perfect person to go to. If Annie Duke had the same problem and took it to like the Annie Duke fan club on Facebook, what kind of suggestions and support would she get? Like she almost subjects herself to like being in an echo chamber. No, Annie, you did the right thing. We love you. Like, just keep going out there, fight the good fight. And I'm like, that actually could be poisonous to your development. Like you need to sometimes hear the criticism and you need to be objective about it. And I think that same thing applies in StarCraft, right? So like if I went to, I love my community, guys, don't take this the wrong way. If I went to you guys after a loss to, somebody in the community that maybe we don't like, and they'll say, no, you know what, that guy he played stupid, like don't even worry about it, like keep your head up. And like that level of support helps in an emotional way, does not really help in like an objective get better at the game way, right? So like I feel like there's a lot of uh uh as the cat meows, I'm like, now that's all I can think about. But I think there's a lot of like I think there's a lot of requirements for somebody else to look at your stuff is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. It's I mean, and this is the idea with the overall with the truth seeking pod or the truth seeking group. And spoiler alert, we're talking about this on Discord prior to the show about whether or not we should create one of these for our group. Interestingly, Eret's Discord. Uh, so big shout out for Eret's Discord. If you're not a member of Eret's Discord, join it, because in the SC2 channel, we actually do this a lot. I realized this later on. People talk about stuff and what they can improve, and there's a lot of good discussion going on in Eret's Discord about um, improvement. But I think what LambNRice has said is so very important, is that if you're not explicitly in the contract of I want to get advice, it's not going to go over well, right? So, and this is exactly what happens in Twitch chat. You go to any, name a big streamer who plays well, go to their Twitch chat, and there are people that are doing the "you're so great" no matter what happens, and then there's people that are doing like "you're terrible because you did X, Y, and Z" no matter what happens, and neither one of those are helpful. They're both bad in different ways. However, and you hear this actually quite a lot about in StarCraft about I think the most recent thing I can think of is casting. And I remember
Mm.
hearing, maybe it was Fear Dragon or somebody else saying, "Well, I go to other casters and I ask for their opinion to get better, because if I go to the community, right, like that's not going to help." But there are, if somebody's a caster and they go to Pig and say, "Pig, how can I get better?" Um, Pig is probably invested in them improving, especially if they're casting with them in different events and so
Mm-hmm.
on. And same thing with StarCraft. You need to have the truth seeking pod. Uh, I can't actually remember in the book why she chooses the word pod, but if it has to do with like pod in the animal kingdom,
Mm.
as in like a pod of dolphins, they look out for each other, right? And so this is sort of the thing, is you have to have this connection between the people in your group
Mm-hmm.
who are looking out for each other, but also willing to give you you know, the real deal, the straight
Mm-hmm.
dope, right? They're
Mm-hmm.
not going to sugarcoat it. Like, yeah, you played bad there, and this is what you did incorrect.
Yeah.
Your micro was off. You made a decision to move your army here, and it was defending nothing when you should have had it there. And that's the sort of feedback that you need to improve. And I think probably coaches do this to some extent as well, and probably a reason why people improve when they are getting coached, if they're open and receptive to their coach's advice, because you need an objective person to
Yeah,
point out your mistakes.
I feel like the social contract part is so important to that,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like you are, by asking for somebody's feedback in that way, you're declaring whatever you say, it's not going to hurt me, right? So
Mm.
you've basically opened the door for criticism and feedback and praise when it's right, but
Mm-hmm.
you're you've basically said, "Hey, man, I've opened up my chest. Like I'm like you can't hurt me. Like let's do it. I need to hear this." Whereas if you do that in other contexts, it may not be the case.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you internalize it that way, Lamb, because for me, the experience has actually been uh, still good, and I still want to do this, but I would have actually codified it as "you can hurt me," which is kind of interesting. Maybe this is back to like the stoicism versus not thing. So I was going to caution everybody that like you should do this, you should do the decision making pod thing, but like it isn't going to feel good when your buddy comes up to you and says, "I think you're full of shit right now," right? Like, and even
Mm-hmm.
if they don't say it that way, even if they're being as gentle as they possibly can, you aren't going to like it. You're going to bristle a little bit. And I've had this happen before. I've had, so Clown Boys, one of my, longtime viewers, my real life best friend since the sixth grade, has had to take me aside a couple times in my life and be like, "You are full of shit right now. I don't think what you're doing is right." And thankfully I have the kind of relationship with him where um he could do that, and I think it's because he hasn't done it very many times. And I've known him like over 2 decades now, or whatever it is, right? Um, when he did it, I was like, well, shit, he's never done this before. I guess I'm wrong, right? Like, and I still didn't like it, but it's that social contract of, all right, well, I value this person. I'm not gonna like cut him out of my life because he told me I was wrong once. You know what I mean? So I have to listen to it.
Mm.
So I don't know if that's just me or if this is one of those things where it depends on the person or depends on the situation. But that's been my experience with it. It doesn't feel good in the moment, but I do like the outcome of interfacing with the truth instead of whatever what kind of like bullshit narrative I feel like cooking up to make myself feel good about my life.
Mm. Yeah, I think I'm trying to think of the best way to say this, but I think when you ask for like that feedback or you ask for the criticism, maybe the declaration isn't so much you can't hurt me. Maybe getting hurt is part of the process,
Hmm.
but maybe it means our relationship is won't be damaged by this,
Yes.
right? And you're like, hey, we're not bruising what's going on between you
Mm-hmm.
and me. I'll take some hurt because I'm waiting for it, I'm expecting it, but like you're still my bro at the end of the day, right?
Yeah. Oh, that's a really good way to put it, dude.
No one likes criticism. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, that's just how it is, right? No one likes to hear that they've done something, they are not good at something, or they've made a bad decision, they've acted in a bad way. But I think, yeah, LambNRice really, what a wonderful way to put it, and probably a great way to segue into a Q&A, because I think we're running out of time.
Yes.
Um,
Which is my fault for putting
have,
way too many quotes in the show notes.
I know, no fault at all. So I think to put it in the context of, this is what I need to hear, and the person saying it to you is, this is because I care about you, right?
Mm,
So even if it
Mm-hmm.
hurts, and you can think about it in so many different ways. Sometimes you got to take medicine. Medicine isn't going to be very pleasant, but if you take it, you'll be better.
Yeah. Cool. Well, we do have a good chunk of interesting Q&A here. Thank you again to Lord Richard and to all of the memers in the chat for producing all this for us. Um, so one that Lithixerg asked is, optimal play is eliminating chance, right? There's always some luck or chance, but you want to squish that luck down until it only matters in small portions. What do you guys think about that?
This is actually addressed in the book, that we tried to put, in terms of poker, that players try to put poker into this zero-sum game, and they try to make it more like chess, where you have all the information all the time. Um, but I don't. My personal opinion, I fully admit I could be wrong in this. I don't think that there is a situation that I can believe that StarCraft would become that, even in the most optimal play. I say that with one caveat: AI may be able to do that.
Hmm.
So when we see Alpha Star facing Alpha Star in the highest level of AI development in the future, maybe that is the situation where it is completely optimal and perfectly played,
Hmm.
and all the lack of information is gone. But I personally don't believe that a human can do that.
LambNRice, what do you think?
I think if you play optimally, or as optimal as a person can, and by the way, we should be striving to if you're trying to win, then yes, you're reducing luck and variance. I don't think you're eliminating it. Um, I think when you are able to narrow the range of things that your opponent is doing, there are often responses that you can do that cover either most or all of those
Hmm.
things, right? In poker, I guess there's a good analogy for poker. They talk about ranges a lot. So, like, based on bet sizing, based on what position of the table they're sitting at, based on how aggressive they've been, based on historical data, you can start to put people on certain ranges of hands, of strength of hands that somebody has. And I think StarCraft has some similarity to that, right? You're like, based on, okay, you did the one base this, you're upgrading on your forge, like you're starting to piece together. If you
Hmm.
made this, if you dedicated your gas to the robo, that means you can't have double Stargate behind it at this juncture in the game, right? Um, Still, I think the thing that you can't know is like what somebody's intentions are all the time, right? That's the human element. You can't like look into their soul directly in a StarCraft game. I could be wrong. Maybe some people do that.
It happens
Um,
occasionally and it feels
yeah,
spectacular. Oh my god.
the mind reader, right? In the
Yeah.
FGC, they call it the sick read.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Oh, that go ahead, go ahead.
no, I was just gonna go back to the question. I think there you are reducing the amount of luck, whether or not you can get rid of it entirely. Um, you know what? I'm gonna be bold. I'm gonna say no, you can't. I'm gonna say no, you cannot fully eliminate.
I like it. I like it. It's always fun when we have different viewpoints, right? Because like these guys both gave a rationale. I'm like, yeah, okay, I can see it. And this is kind of this is the book in action, right? It's like, well, all right, what percentage? You know, having for me having heard these two arguments, what percentage am I on each of them, right? And maybe it's 48-52, right? And I, if you made me pick, I'm still picking, you know, Adraseth's or Lamb's argument, but. Hi, Kat. Yes. Do you want to be on the show again? You can. Here, come on. Let's talk about the book. What do you think? Um, yeah, so I think that's really kind of interesting. So jumping to I guess the
Whoa,
next
whoa, 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 whoa!
what?
You got to give your viewpoint on the question too.
Oh,
We
okay,
just
okay,
gotta
okay,
know.
fair, fair.
Yeah, you can't
Um,
dodge.
let's see. Um, I agree with Lithic that you should strive to squish down the uncertainty. Um, I don't know that that's how I would define optimal play, right? So I'm cheating because I get to read the question again, right? The question is phrased as, but optimal play is eliminating chance, right? I think that, um, hi, man, he's like really getting up in here right now. Um, uh, I think there are a lot of pieces to optimal play, and maybe I'm putting words in Lithic's mouth here. Maybe he meant this in the sense of it would be optimal too, or a component of optimal play is to eliminate all chance. Yeah, I mean, I think you strive for it. I don't think that you can ever completely do it, though. That's my answer. It's my 52-48.
It's a good answer.
Um, so Dalsim asked, um, why do something that is not rewarding and look for focus goals when there are so many other hobbies a person can take up? This is actually a really good question. Ooh.
Shout out Dollism mod in my chat.
Oh, it's
So
Dullism. I'm sorry, I misread the name. My bad.
It happens all the time.
Um, were you gonna say something, Edgar Seth? You want to buy me some time
yeah,
here?
I definitely can say something. So in I think every person's going to have a different answer for the question. But so I will speak to my personal reasoning and my personal goals in life. I find learning very pleasurable. Right? I've literally dedicated my entire life to learning. I work in a profession that is all about learning, and I spend my free time doing things that. So when I am not playing StarCraft, I am teaching scuba diving. When I'm not teaching scuba diving, I'm conducting research. When I'm not conducting research, I'm teaching earth science. So there's literally no aspect of my life that doesn't involve some, part of learning. Like all my hobbies are around that. And so I personally feel very high level of fulfillment if I am improving myself. So my personal goal is to be the best human I can be. And so even if it's something as trivial as being good in StarCraft, I find that as a valuable because I do think that there are far-reaching implications for being good in StarCraft in life in general. Not to mention being part of the StarCraft community, I think is pretty nice. And so if you if you play if I and I think Arid has said this on stream as well, and we've definitely talked about it. If I was not streaming and I played alone at home and I was still trying to get better, I would not nearly take as much enjoyment as interacting with other people in the community and all trying to get better at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I think that's pretty much the answer is that I get a great deal of enjoyment and fulfillment out of trying to be a better person. And I think StarCraft, in my opinion, can facilitate that.
LambNRice, you have thoughts? If not, I can.
Uh, You first.
Okay. Um, so yeah, the cat is really trying to steal the show. As Lord Cranial saying in the chat. Um, so yeah, my thought on this is that so earlier we talked about part of the book where Annie discusses wanting to align sort of your body, your lizard brain, the meat bag part of you with your long-term goals that your like cognitive processes desire, right? And this for me is that. So in the short term, I might whine to Coach Printf and say, I don't want to do mineral wall cannon rushes. I don't like them. I lose my games when it happens, and I feel stupid in front of a crowd. And I might be real whiny on stream. This might have happened 2 days ago. Um, However, if I can in some way sort of separate that tendency from my overall desire, which is to improve my micro and improve my decision making and be calm in hectic situations, then a long term goal of being able to play a Cannon Rush style is something that I desire, right? So focus goals are a bridge to get to where I want to be, even though maybe some of the steps along that route aren't going to feel very good, right? Like, I think it was Monday night this week, I hit Diamond 1 playing more standard, right? Not opening Forge. Um, but I concluded that I needed to work on my cannon play, and the next day was hell, and I lost all my games, and it sucked, and, thankfully I was on a different account and stuff. But it's easy to feel good when you're on those highs, right? You're just killing people with adept all ends and getting Diamond 1 or whatever. But you need something for those rough days, or you're never going to get to the place you're trying to go, because between here and there are some good days and some bad days. And if on the bad days you just get pissed off and stop playing or go play Fortnite or whatever it is, like you're not going to get there as quick or ever. So for me, that's kind of the point of doing a focus goal.
If I'm understanding the question right, he's like, why do this when there are many other things you can do? So why like endure the punishment, right? Um, maybe this is high level, but like I have a belief that hey, anything that is of value or rewarding has some level of resistance that's going to be high, right? And I think in a day like in the century that we live in, like everything that people seek is usually pretty quick and like gratifying and fulfilling, and like it's indicative because there are far fewer StarCraft players today than there were, whenever else in the past you look at, right? And it's because your options of like what other games could we play? There's so many others that like get you that quick hit, man. You're gonna play Candy Crush and you're just gonna friggin' destroy it. It's gonna be great, and it's super rewarding instantly. Whereas StarCraft has like this long rewarding cycle that I'm gonna be biased because I play StarCraft is way more fulfilling, man. Like, and being good at that is way better than being good at Candy Crush. It just feels a lot better. And I think the same goes true for most other things in life. Like, usually the path of more resistance tends to yield the better fruit.
Yep. StarCraft, the eating your veggies and exercising of video games.
We got one more.
Yeah, let's
One
do
more
it.
question.
So Distilled Chaos asks, I may have missed this bit, but I wonder what other tools there are for understanding the role luck plays in some outcome, and that if you have access to something like the replay, you can fill in a lot of gaps in information, but you don't always have that tool. So this is like a great question for doing the thing that we talked about at the beginning of the stream, which is, StarCraft is a great little sandbox for us to kind of rapidly run into these problems and situations and do all the poking and prodding at our own internals to learn these lessons, right? But ultimately, I think we're all pretty interested in applying this stuff outside in real life too, right? So, I mean, there's not always going to be a replay of me getting mad at the Chipotle guy and quitting Chipotle, famously, right? Like, if you aren't up to speed on this story happened in Discord earlier this week, but you know, yeah, I do think that there are techniques, right? So one of them is the thing that I did, right? You tell the story to your truth-seeking pod, and you do the "Am I full of shit?" check, right? Now, What's tricky about that, though, is I'm going to give my version of events, right? Chipotle guy isn't in the Discord, right? Yeah, Lord Craniel, Chipotle or Air It versus unnamed Chipotle employee, right? Unnamed Chipotle employee doesn't get to go up on the witness stand, only I do. So you are somewhat reliant on yourself to give a more legit version of the story than you might be inclined to do. But I do think, Adversef's point about everybody being biased, even if you've had training not to be, kind of applies here too. Like, you're always going to bullshit even your truth seeking pod a little bit. Um, I don't know. That's about all I've got on it. I think you can try. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I think the role of your truth seeking pod is to challenge your story, right?
Hmm.
And they might say, I don't know what the Chipotle story is, but if it's you versus the Chipotle guy, they might say, like, well, what was the context by which conflict happened?
Yeah.
Who else was involved?
Right.
Who threw what at who? So it's like, it's their job to like ask those questions, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I buy it.
If I'm taking a crack at this question, if we're thinking about it from like the StarCraft perspective, like what are the tools for figuring out what's luck and what's not?
Mm-hmm.
I think I don't want to beat a dead horse, but like I think the truth-seeking pod and like sharing replays with your friends, people you trust, people who are in the social contract, I think that's one way. I think the other, I think experience does play a role in this, right? And if you're able to look at your own history playing the game, I think you can identify at times what's luck and what's not, and then you confirm that with your group.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that would be my answer.
I like that.
I would add to that too is let's imagine a world where we didn't have replays as readily available or at all.
That would be sick. By the way.
Well, I would be right 100% of the time. I know that. But if we had that situation and we still had a truth-seeking pod, this is partly the reason I think that if people realize it or not, I'm not. When you watch a professional player from first-person view play and you see mistakes, you're like, they did what? They didn't micro that, or they didn't do this. And that's because, viewer, your brain is not entangled in all the different possibilities that their brain is dealing with, in addition to automating all the basic and foundational actions they needed to take to keep the game running in their favor. And this is one thing that I've done definitely 100% with people who are willing in my Twitch stream, as well as other people in their Twitch streams, is that you can just watch the game objectively from their point of view and see where there are mistakes, because you actually have the ability to just stare at the minimap if you want to. Like you don't have to do anything else, and you can gain so much value from staring at the minimap. And pro tip, I don't know if anybody's tried casting, but if you want to be a good caster, stare at the minimap and look up at the production. Don't look at the middle of the map. Yeah. That's actually one of the best ways to learn what's going on in the game, because you will see everything moving, capture it with the observing. And so this is something that could be done in that way if you want to bring it to StarCraft, in terms of like, okay, let's say we don't have replays. Another tool is have your friend watch the minimap and see if you're observing all the things that actually are happening in the game, like scouting, catching that little blip on there. And I know we can't look at the map all the time, but your friend can then say, oh, did you know the army position X when you moved out? Because how many games have we had where I had one last night where I moved across the map. I even said it on stream. I was like, well, I'm going to move out. I'm not sure if this is a good idea because I could get attacked time, but I'm going to take a risk. And I moved out. Hellions rolled into my base 10 seconds later. And I thought, how did I even pass them? But, of course, two trains in the night sort of thing.
Right.
So it's stuff like that. I think that it relates to we in StarCraft, we are kind of lucky to have that ability to watch directly somebody's first person view.
Makes sense. Cool. Well, I think that's about us done here, and we told poor LambNRice that we take about 2 hours. We've taken 2.5 hours of your time now, so thank you for
officially
putting up
our
with us.
longest episode.
Sick. No, this was fucking awesome, guys, and I appreciate you guys having me on.
Yeah,
Well,
thanks
thank
so much
you.
for coming on.
Yeah, your questions and the points that you made tonight were super insightful, and I really love the book suggestion too. So thank you